Hello, A-Push people. How are you guys doing this Saturday? So, I pulled out the board because I may want to use it. I am gonna use it for today's video. It's not really a lecture. It's a video. If you want to watch it, you can. If you don't want to watch it, that's perfectly fine for me. I will use it next year. So today we are going to break down McCarthy's speech from the second Red Scare. This was the only reason you'll be watching this video is if you need help answering the 3 questions about the speech in Saturday's assignment. So we're gonna go paragraph by paragraph and break this speech down. First off, this speech is called Enemies from Within. What does he mean by that? What does he mean by enemies from within? So, what we know about the second Red Scare, it is from the inside of our government. They were scared about communists coming in and infiltrating our government in high military offices, right? So, this was a speech delivered in West Virginia in 1950. So, 1950, let's see. World War II ended 1945. Cold War was happening. So the end of the Cold War. End of Cold War is when this speech was happening during the second Red Scare event. And let's boil down the root cause of the Cold War, and we've been discussing this in depth for a while now. The Cold War was really about this idea. It was an ideal war. It was a war over ideals. So, Cold War. I'm going off on a tangent, but it helps us answer this question. The Cold War was a war over ideals. And what are those ideals? For the U.S., it was democracy. U.S. democracy. The Soviet Union was communism. So this was a war between ideals, between communism of the Soviet Union and democracy of the United States. So now that we broke down the background and the date and established the time period, established the background, let's go to paragraph 1, excerpt 1 of this speech. So I'm gonna read excerpt 1. You can follow along under the speech button on the material. So the first excerpt. Tonight, as we celebrate the 141st birthday of one of the great men in American history, I would like to be able to talk about what a glorious day today in the history of the world. As we celebrate the birth of this man, who with his whole heart and soul hated war, I would like to be able to speak of peace in our time, of war being outlawed, and of worldwide disarmament. These would be truly appropriate things to be able to mention as we celebrate the birthday of Abraham Lincoln. So right off the bat, there was a connection to Abe Lincoln. And Joseph McCarthy contrasted what he believed to be a day worth of celebrating, a day worth of celebrating of Abraham Lincoln's birthday. But instead he's delivering a speech because he feels like there's communism inside of our government. So we have, first off, connection to Abe Lincoln. Just gonna put A-L for Abe Lincoln. So let's go to the second paragraph. He hasn't fully addressed the theme of this speech yet. So, 5 years after a world war has been won, so World War II, now he's making a connection to World War II. Men's heart should anticipate a long peace, and men's minds should be free from the heavy weight that comes with war. But this is not such a period. So here's where it goes from we should be celebrating all these accomplishments, Abe Lincoln's birthday, peace at last after winning a world war, but no. For this is not a period of peace. This is a time of the Cold War. This is a time when all the world is split into two vast, increasingly hostile armed camps. A time of a great armament race. Today, we can almost physically hear the mutterings and rumblings of an invigorated God of War. You can see it, feel it, and hear it all the way from the hills of Indochina, from the shores of Formosa, right over into the heart of Europe itself. So, it keeps bringing back this connection to World War II and how we put nuclear arms into these cities. Not our brightest day. He says it's an arms race between what two countries? The U.S. and the Soviet Union. Do you see where I'm going here? Yeah. Let's continue. Today we are engaged in a final all-out battle between communistic atheism and Christianity. The modern champions of communism had selected this as the time. And ladies and gentlemen, the chips are down. They are truly down. So, instead of framing it as communistic versus democratic, like we did all this chapter, he phrased it as a battle between atheism and Christianity. Lest there be any doubt that the time has been chosen, let us go directly to the leader of communism today, Joseph Stalin. Here is what he said. Not back in 1928, not before the war, not during the war, but 2 years after the last war was ended. So this is Joseph Stalin speaking. To think that a communist revolution can be carried out peacefully within the framework of Christian democracy means one has either gone out of one's mind and lost all normal understanding, or has grossly and openly repudiated the communist revolution. So what is Joseph Stalin saying here that Joseph McCarthy wants to echo? This is the time. This is the time. The chips are down. We are ready. The communist vision is out in full swing, and Joseph Stalin even admitted it, that they aren't going down peacefully. So, what's next? How? So, this is back to Joseph McCarthy speaking. And this is what was said by Lenin in 1919, which was quoted with approval by Stalin in 1947. We are living, said Lenin, not merely in a state, but in a system of states, and the existence of the Soviet Republic side by side with Christian states for a long time is unthinkable. One or the other must triumph in the end. And before the end supervenes, a series of frightful collisions between the Soviet Republic and the states will be inevitable. So they are not going down without a fight. According to Stalin and Lenin, the communism leaders are saying they are going to take hold of these ideals and spread them around the world. So, ladies and gentlemen, can there be anyone here tonight who is so blind as to say that the world war is not on? Can there be anyone who fails to realize that the communist world has said the time is now? That this is the time for the showdown between the democratic Christians world and the communist atheist world. Unless we face this fact, we shall pay the price that must be paid by those who wait too long. So the time is now for the communist regimes. The time is now, and they're not going down without a fight. So, yeah. 6 years ago, at the time of the first conference to map out peace, there was within the Soviet orbit 180 people lined up on the anti-totalitarian side. There were in the world at the time roughly 1.6 billion people. Today, only 6 years later, there are 800 million people under the absolute domination of Soviet Russia. An increase of over 400%. On our side, the figure has shrunk to around 500 million people. In other words, in less than 6 years, the odds have changed from 9-1 in our favor to 8-5 against us. This indicates the swiftness of the tempo of communist victories and American defeats in the Cold War. As one of our outstanding historical figures once said, when a great democracy is destroyed, it will not be because of enemies from without, but rather because of enemies from within. The truth of this statement is becoming terrifyingly clear as we see this country each day losing on every front. So, communist ideas increased 400%. And here we have him laying out his main point. There's enemies within our borders. There has to be. Because we are losing on every front. 400%. That's a big That's a big increase. Increased by 400%. That's big increase. And we are losing on every front. It went from 9 to 1, 4 to 8 to 5 against. That's big. At war's end, we were physically the strongest nation on earth, and at least potentially the most powerful, intellectual, and morally. Ours could have been the honor of being a beacon in the desert of destruction, a shining, living proof that civilization was not yet ready to destroy itself. Unfortunately, we have failed miserably and tragically to arise to the opportunity. We are failing. That's his main point, at least in the first part of this speech. The U.S. is failing. That's his point. the reason we find ourselves in a position of impotency is not because our only powerful potential enemy has been meant to invade our shores, but rather because of the traitorous actions of those who have been treated so well by this nation. It has not been the less fortunate or members of minority groups who have been selling this nation out, but rather those who have had all the benefits that the wealthiest nation on earth has had to offer: the finest homes, the finest college education, and the finest jobs in government we can give. This is glaringly true in the State Department. They're the bright young men who are born with silver spoons in their mouths are the ones who have been worse. So this is coming from our own government. This is coming from the State Department specifically. They are traitors. He is laying out that platform. They are traitors. They are a complete disgrace for our country. They are traitors. Now I know it is very easy for anyone to condemn a particular bureau or department in general terms. Therefore, I would like to cite one rather unusual case. The case of a man who has done much to shape our foreign policy. When Chiang Kai-shek was fighting our war, the State Department had in China a young man named John S. Service. His task, obviously, was not to work for the communization of China. Strangely, however, he sent official reports back to the State Department urging that we torpedo our ally Chiang Kai-shek and start stating, in effect, that communism was the best hope of China. So, this is unproven right now, but this John S. Service basically sent reports to our own State Department that he's on the ground in China and communism is the best course of action to be taken here. This didn't go over well with McCarthy. Later, this man, John Service, was picked up by the Federal Bureau of Investigation for turning over to the Communist Secret State Department information. Strangely, however, he was never prosecuted. However, Joseph Grew, the Undersecretary of State, who insisted on his prosecution, was forced to resign. 2 days after, Grew's successor, Dean Acheson, took over as Undersecretary of State. This man, John Service, who had been picked up by the FBI and who had previously been promoted, and finally, under Acheson, placed in charge of all placements and promotion. Today, ladies and gentlemen, this man, Service, is on his way to represent the State Department. By far and away, the most important listening post in the Far East. So we've seen him botch. His whole claim is we've seen him botched the foreign policy in China. Botch it. Completely botch it. And I'm at the position that this Joseph McCarthy is telling the truth. So we see Service botched foreign policy in China. Why are we trusting him? Wasn't he prosecuted? And why are we trusting him with carrying out our foreign policy goals in the Far East? Let's continue. Now let's see what happens when individuals with communist connections are forced out of the State Department. Gustave Durand, who was labeled, as I quote, a notorious international communist, was made Assistant Secretary of State in charge of Latin American affairs. He was taken into the State Department from his job as a lieutenant colonel in the Communist International Brigade. Finally, after intense congressional pressure and criticism, he resigned in 1946 from the State Department. And ladies and gentlemen, where do you think he is now? He took over a high salaried job as chief of Cultural Activities Section in the office of the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations. So now, a suspected communist, by his own account, is working in the United Nations. So, let's recap what we have. So we have credible stories of communism in the State Department, and people in top levels who pledge they are communist, and the State Department is doing nothing to stop it. This is the whole conclusion of this part of this speech. The State Department is doing nothing to stop it. And the reason why I'm so passionate is because he was passionate. This was a passionate speech. Because at the time, there was many fearful Americans. Who was convinced that these ideals of communism will come to the United States in the federal government. And Joseph McCarthy is saying that this fear is real. They are here. The communists are here in the top levels of the federal government. Okay. This, ladies and gentlemen, gives you somewhat of a picture of the type of individuals who have been helping to shape our foreign policy. In my opinion, the State Department, which is one of the most important government departments, is thoroughly infested with communism. So, the State Department is full with communists. So, State Department full of communists. Where's another? So State Department is full of communists. State Department full of commies, because that's what they were called back in the day, commies. I have in my hand 57 cases of individuals who would appear to be either card-carrying members or certainly loyal to the Communist Party, but who nevertheless are still helping to shape our foreign policy. So these communists is still here. They are still actively working in our government, shaping our foreign policy. One thing to remember is in discussing the communists in our government is that we are not dealing with spies who get 30 pieces of silver to steal the blueprints of a new weapon. We are dealing with a far more sinister type of activity because it permits the enemy to guide and shape our policy. This brings us down to the case of Alger Hiss, who is important not as an individual anymore, but rather because he is so representative of a group in the State Department. It is unnecessary to go over the sordid event showing how he sold out the nation, which had given him so much. Those are rather fresh in all of our minds. However, it should be remembered that the facts in regard to his connection with this international communist spy ring was made known to the then Under-Secretary of State Burl 3 days after Hitler and Stalin signed the Russo-German Alliance Pact. At that time, when Widmer Chambers, who was also a part of the spy ring, apparently decided that with Russia on Hitler's side, he could no longer betray our nation to Russia. He gave Under-Secretary of State Burl, and this is all a matter of record, particularly all, if not more, of the facts upon which Hiss's conviction was based. So he actually tells the story of Hiss. We learned about this story in our textbooks a few days ago. This made national news because really at that time it was exposed. This communist ring was exposed when Alger Hiss was exposed. Under-Secretary Burl promptly contacted Dean Atkins and received word in return that Atkins, and I quote, could vouch for Hiss absolutely, at which time the matter was dropped. And this, you understand, was at a time when Russia was an ally of Germany. This condition existed while Russia and Germany were invading and dismembering Poland. And while the communist groups here are screaming warmonger at the United States for their support of the Allied nations. So he is correct about them infiltrating foreign policy. They tried to establish foreign policy and change foreign policy. Again, in 1945, 3. The FBI had occasion to investigate the facts surrounding Hiss's contacts with the Russia spy ring. But even after the FBI report was submitted, nothing was done. Then late in 1948, on August 5th, when the Un-American Activities Committee called Alger Hiss to give an accounting, President Truman at once issued a presidential directive ordering all government agencies to refuse to turn over any information whatsoever in regard to the communist activities of any government employee to a congressional committee. Incidentally, even after Hiss was convicted, it is interesting to note that the president still labeled the expose of Hiss as a red herring. If time permitted, it might be well to go into detail about the fact that Hiss was Roosevelt's chief advisor at Yalta when Roosevelt was admittedly in ill health and tired physically and mentally, and when, according to the Secretary of State, Hiss drafted the report on the conference. So, this is big because Joseph McCarthy is saying that the president was even involved in communistic activities. And that is big. That's a big allegation. So, Yalta was exposed, and them shaping foreign policy even back then. So let's wrap this thing up. According to the then Secretary of State, Stettinius, here are some of the things that Hiss helped to decide at Yalta. So this was a communist actively trying to change the shape of foreign policy in America. 1. The establishment of a European High Commission. 2. The treatment of Germany. This, you will recall, was the conference at which it was decided that he would occupy Berlin and Russia occupying an area completely encircling the city, which, as you know, resulted in the Berlin airlift, which cost 31 American lives. So the communists trying to change U.S. foreign policy directly influenced the killing of 31 American lives, according to McCarthy. 3. The Polish question. 4. The relationship between UNRRA and the Soviet. 5. The rights of Americans on control commissions of Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary. 6. Iran. 7. China. Here's where we gave away Manchuria. 8. Turkish Straits question. 9. International trusteeship. And 10. Korea. Of the results of this conference, Arthur Bliss Lane of the State Department had this to say. As I glanced over the document, I could not believe my eyes. To me, almost every line spoke of a surrender to Stalin. So, McCarthy is claiming that communists are only here in this country to radically change our FP, foreign policy. So, Yalta. That is where Joseph McCarthy lays this down. This goes back to changing foreign policy in Yalta. As you hear this story of high treason, I know what you are saying to yourself. Well, why doesn't the Congress do something about it? Actually, ladies and gentlemen, one of the important reasons for the graft, the corruption, the dishonesty, and disloyalty, the treason in high government positions, one of the most important reasons why this continues is a lack of moral uprising on the part of the 140 million American people. In the light of history, however, that is not hard to explain. It is the result of an emotionally hangover and temporary moral lapse which follows every war. It is the epiphany to evil which people who have been subjected to the tremendous evils of war feel. As the people of the world see mass murder, the destruction of defenseless and innocent people, and all of the crime and lack of morals which go with war, they become numb and empathic. It has always been thus after war. However, the morals of our people have not been destroyed. They still exist. The cloak of numbness and empathy has only needed a spark to rekindle them. Happily, this spark has finally been supplied. So McCarthy is ending his speech with a plea to the American people that we must change. We must demand better. We must demand that there's no more communisms from within. We must do that. We must stop enemies from within. As you know, very recently the Secretary of State proclaimed his loyalty to a man guilty of what has already been considered as the most abominable of all crimes, of being a traitor to the people who gave him a position of great trust. The Secretary of State, in attempting to justify his continued devotion to the man, sold out the Christian world to the atheistic world, referred to Christ's Sermon on the Mount as a justification and reason, therefore, and the reaction of the American people to this would have made the heart of Abraham Lincoln happy. When the prominent diplomat in striped pants, with a phony British accent, proclaimed to the American people that Christ on the Mount endorsed communism, high treason, and betrayal of a sacred trust, The blasphemy was so great that it awakened the dormant indignation of the American people. He was lighted the spark which is resulting in a moral uprising and will end only when the whole sorry mess of twisted, warped thinkers are swept from the national scene so that we may have a new birth of national honesty and decency in government. So he's making that plea to the American people. Thank you for those who watched my breakdown of the Enemies from Within speech.